Ashridge wasn't just forgotten, it was erased. Nestled deep in the sandstone bluffs of southern Utah, it had once been a bustling mining town. Then, sometime in the late 80s, people stopped talking about it. Those who lived nearby crossed themselves when they drove past the turnoff. Kids were warned to never wander too far into the hills, and maps? They hadn't shown Ashridge in over 30 years. So when Ellis Mourner arrived in a weather-beaten SUV and took up residence in the old Holloway house, the few remaining locals reacted the way dying animals react to distant thunder. They froze. He came in the fall, when the wind howled through broken fences and the desert sun gave way to cold, starless nights. He rented the place online, unseen, paid in advance, said he was researching regional folklore for a book. People didn't ask questions. They just watched. The Holloway house stood at the far edge of town, perched on a rise that overlooked the dried-out creek bed and a crumbling stone well no one had touched in decades. Locals believed the land was tired. That's what they called it when things stopped growing and animals stopped birthing and shadows moved the wrong way around corners. The house had been empty since '89, since the night, well, they didn't talk about that night. Not sober anyway. Ellis unpacked his things with the meticulous calm of a man who had nowhere else to be. 3 crates of books, a duffel bag, a journal bound in cracked brown leather. On the first night, he lit a fire and sat by the window, watching the town through warped glass. No streetlights, just the flicker of a TV in a trailer far off. The rest was dark. The next morning, he visited the corner store. Only 2 people were inside, the clerk and an old man in a dusty wheelchair. "You lost?" the clerk asked, trying to sound casual. "No," Ellis replied. "I just moved in. Holloway property." The old man turned his head, slowly, like it hurt. "No one moves into Holloway," he muttered. "Not unless they're called." Ellis tilted his head, curious. "Called?" The man smiled with only half his mouth. "House likes certain folks, ones with open doors." The clerk. "Ignore him. He drinks pine cleaner." Forced cheerfulness. "Welcome to Ashridge." That night, Ellis visited the well. He stood beside it for a long time, staring into the pit. Dry, cracked, silent. He knelt, placing his hand on the rim, whispering something. His voice wasn't loud, but the wind died when he spoke, and somewhere inside the earth, something turned. Something that had been asleep for a very long time. 3 days passed. Ellis Mourner barely left the property. Locals watched from afar as smoke curled from the Holloway chimney each night. Some said they heard strange noises, murmurs carried on the wind, rhythmic tapping like bones against stone. But no one dared climb the hill. On the 4th day, something changed. Eli Granger, an 11-year-old boy with a slingshot and too much curiosity, dared to creep near the property. He stayed hidden in the brush, squinting at the porch. Ellis sat cross-legged on the steps, facing a large flat stone he'd pulled from beneath the porch. On it, he'd arranged small bones, lengths of blackened string, and what looked like dried rose petals. He wasn't praying. He was listening. Eli swore he saw the man nod to nothing and say a single word. "Free." He ran all the way home. That night, Reverend O'Connell knocked on Ellis's door. The Reverend was the only man in Ashridge who still wore a collar. 60, stooped and sharp-eyed. Ellis opened the door part way. Candlelight flickered behind him. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," O'Connell said. Flatly, "You are," Ellis replied without emotion. "I'd like to ask a few questions about the rituals." Ellis didn't blink. "They're not rituals. They're invitations." Flinching, O'Connell flinched. "To what?" "To memory." The Reverend stared for a moment. There are things in this town that should stay buried. Ellis leaned against the frame, voice steady. Then you should have burned them properly. O'Connell's mouth opened, then closed. He stepped back. I'll be watching, Mr. Mourner. Calmly, you're already late, Ellis said. The door clicked shut. The following morning, the sand around the well had shifted. 5 concentric circles, each about a foot apart, perfectly carved into the ground. No footprints, no tool marks, just bare earth, patterned like a ritual site. Locals found it first, whispered about it at the diner. Reverend O'Connell returned with a Bible and a bottle of holy water. He poured it down the well. Nothing happened until nightfall. At 2:17 a.m., a low hum began beneath the Holloway house. The sound pulsed like breath, deep, heavy, ancient. It passed through floorboards, through foundation, through rock. Inside his room, Ellis sat cross-legged, eyes closed. In front of him, a wooden bowl filled with ink-dark water began to tremble. He whispered the name again. Free. From somewhere outside the room, a woman screamed, not from fear, from memory. The next morning, Ashridge felt off. Birds didn't sing. The diner's neon sign flickered despite perfect wiring. Someone's goats broke through the fence and refused to return, staring at the hill with wide, glassy eyes. Ellis didn't leave the house, but at precisely 2:17 p.m., exactly 12 hours after the hum, he opened the front door, walked down the porch, and made his way to the town archive. It was a one-room building beside the library, kept locked most of the year. Inside sat Marion Field, Ashridge's oldest living resident and self-declared record keeper. She hadn't updated the files in 20 years, but she still sat there every day, sipping stale tea and staring at dusty boxes. Marion looked up when Ellis entered. Her cataract-clouded eyes narrowed. "You're the Holloway guest," she said flatly. Ellis nodded. "I'd like to read the local death records." Marion didn't ask why. She simply stood and shuffled toward a rusted cabinet. "Alphabetical or chronological?" "By location," Ellis said. "Specifically, Holloway Hill." Marion froze. Her mouth opened, but instead of words, she let out a sound like a dry rattle. Her hands shook. She turned slowly and opened the lowest drawer. From the very back, she pulled a single manila envelope. "Wasn't supposed to keep this," she muttered. "Said it was fire damaged, but I remember too well." She placed the envelope on the table. Ellis opened it. Inside, one photo, black and white, slightly scorched. 4 people stood outside the Holloway house in 1989. A family of 3 and a 4th figure, blurred, its head tilted, arms too long, no face. Attached was a coroner's note. 3 dead, 1 unaccounted. No signs of forced entry. All mirrors cracked. Ellis tapped the photo. "Who's the 4th?" Marion swallowed hard. "That ain't a who, Mr. Mourner. That's a what." That night, Ellis didn't light a fire. He sat in silence, the photo pinned to the wall. The bowl of water had turned blacker than ink. Something coiled within it, something small, slow-moving, patient. At 2:17 a.m., the house exhaled. From beneath the floorboards came a voice, low, feminine. "Farrah, open the way." Ellis opened his eyes and smiled. The next day, Marion Field didn't open the archive. Locals assumed it was her arthritis again. But when her niece stopped by with groceries, she found the front door ajar and the lights still on. Marion was sitting upright in her chair, eyes wide open, mouth slightly parted, not breathing. The medical examiner said it was a stroke, but the niece insisted on one strange detail. Her aunt's fingernails were coated in dust, like she'd been digging in her sleep. Meanwhile, Ellis Morner was back in his room facing the bowl. The water no longer rippled. It was still, solid, black. Beneath it, something stirred slowly, like a thought forming in deep time. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small cloth-wrapped bundle, unfolded it. Inside, 4 teeth, 1 button, a fragment of scorched glass. He dropped them into the bowl one by one. When the glass touched the surface, a thin crack echoed through the room. And then, a whispering whisper from the wall behind him. "He remembers." Ellis turned. Nothing, but the air smelled of burning cloth and old breath. That night, Reverend O'Connell visited Marion's house. He entered alone, prayed over her body. Then, drawn by something he couldn't explain, he opened the floorboards beneath her bed. There, in the dirt crawl space, he found a name scratched into the wood. Farrah. Again and again, dozens of times, all carved with fingernails. O'Connell staggered back, praying, whispered a prayer, then something whispered it back. He collapsed on the floor, "Grow," clutching his ears. Back at Holloway House, Ellis opened a notebook. Inside were pages of names. Most were crossed out. Only one remained untouched. Farrah. He took a deep breath, dipped a finger into the black water, and began to draw a symbol on the floor. A ring, then lines, then teeth. As he finished, he spoke aloud, not a whisper this time, commanding, "Return." From beneath the boards came a wet sound, like something exhaling through blood. And then, a soft knock from inside the wall. The knock came again the next night. 3 times, soft, deliberate, from inside the wall behind Ellis's bed. He didn't flinch, didn't speak, just turned toward it and waited. It knocked again, twice, closer. He smiled, satisfied. "You're learning." He got up, lifted the rug, and peeled back a loose floorboard. Beneath, the dirt looked freshly stirred, wet, warm. He whispered into the hole, "I know your name. I remember what they did." The dirt trembled, then settled. Elsewhere in town, strange things began. Clocks stopped at 2:17 a.m., windows cracked with no sound. A baby was born in silence, eyes wide, lips sealed shut. And Nora Mabel, the elderly florist, found all her flowers blackened overnight. The roots had rotted. She touched one, and her fingernails turned gray. She didn't tell anyone, but that night she locked every door, lit a dozen candles, and placed salt at every window. At the church, Reverend O'Connell sat motionless in his office. He hadn't spoken since the collapse. In front of him lay his Bible, open but burned along the edges. The name Farrah had been etched into the leather cover, though he didn't own a knife. Flies gathered around his shoulders. When he finally moved, it was to tear out the final page and eat it. Back at Holloway House, the knocking returned. Not from one place this time, but from everywhere. Walls, floorboards, even the ceiling. Rhythmic, hungry. Ellis stood in the center of the room, barefoot on the symbol he'd drawn. Around him, candles flickered red. He raised his arms, spoke one word, commanding, "Arrive." A rush of air burst from the cracks in the house. Doors slammed open, mirrors shattered inward, and from beneath the floor, a single blackened hand reached up through the symbol, palm first, then vanished. Ellis lowered his arms calmly. Calm. "You're early." The morning after the hand, nothing felt right in Ashridge. The sky looked too pale. The wind blew the wrong way. People whispered without knowing why. At the diner, the cook dropped an entire tray of coffee mugs. None shattered. They just bounced. At the gas station, the lights flickered even when the power was off. And at 2:17 p.m., every mirror in town cracked at the same time. Ellis mourners spent the day in silence. He gathered items from a locked box beneath the floor, a child's drawing, a strip of cloth with initials, a faded locket filled with ash. He placed them in a small wooden box and carried it outside to the dried-up well. The moment the box touched the stone rim, the wind stopped. The world fell silent. He whispered, "This is what you asked for. This is what they buried." The ground beneath him pulsed once, then again. In town, people began to act wrong. Nora Mabel wandered the streets barefoot, singing nursery rhymes in reverse. Her hair turned white in hours. Teenagers at the park reported seeing someone under the swing, even when it wasn't moving. At the clinic, a patient died with eyes open, mouth stitched shut from the inside. The coroner vomited and refused to return. And in the church, Reverend O'Connell walked into the chapel naked, muttering prayers in a language no one recognized, and collapsed at the altar. That night, Ellis marked the ground around the well with salt and burned juniper branches in a circle. He placed the box of relics in the center. Then he cut his palm, letting blood drip onto the lid. The earth. From the shadows behind the well, something began to crawl. Not walk, not slither, crawl. Ellis didn't move. He spoke to the dark, solemn. "You know who I am. You remember my family." The crawling stopped. A voice, rasping and old. "One still breathes." The Holloway house creaked all night. Not from wind, from memory. Floorboards pulsed. Pipes moaned. The wallpaper peeled in slow spirals. Ellis sat still, unmoving, as if meditating through a hurricane. In front of him, the wooden box remained unopened. His blood had dried on its lid, dark and cracked like scorched earth. At 2:17 a.m., the silence broke. A voice, hoarse, layered, feminine, spoke from beneath the floorboards. Hoarse, layered, feminine, whispering, "Do you want to see?" Ellis didn't respond. The voice pressed again, breathy. "You already know the sound of their screams." The floor split, not violently, but like old wood giving up. A narrow hole opened. Inside, darkness spiraled down like a throat. Cold air rose from it, smelling of rot and burnt cedar. Ellis stood, removed his coat, and stepped in. He didn't fall. He descended, slowly, dreamlike, through layers of sound. Cracking bones, breathing sand, whispers that sounded like his mother's voice. Then, firelight. He stood at the edge of a room he hadn't seen since childhood. A kitchen, faded wallpaper, a child's drawing on the fridge, and at the table, his mother, sobbing silently, her back turned. On the floor, blood. 3 people, still, lifeless. One of them was a child. The other, a man whose eyes had been sewn shut. And the third, a woman with her jaw broken open and something scrawled in blood across her collarbone. We saw. Ellis stepped closer. His mother turned, slowly, but it wasn't her face anymore. Her eyes were black holes. Her mouth smiled too wide.
"They paid for forgetting," she said. "But you remember. That's why he hears you."
Behind her, something moved. No form, just presence. Ellis stared straight into it and whispered, determined,
"Then let them remember too."
Ellis awoke back in Holloway House. Or maybe he never left. The floor beneath him was whole again. The box remained sealed, but something was different. He could feel it in the air, in the way the wood sighed beneath his steps, in the soundless weight pressing against the windows. He walked to the mirror in the hallway. His reflection blinked, half a second too late. In town, panic whispered its way through the streets. Reverend O'Connell was missing. The church door had been torn off its hinges. Inside, every page of every hymnal was shredded, and a symbol Ellis had drawn near the well was scorched into the altar cloth. The mayor, a woman named Corin Harrow, called an emergency meeting. Only 8 people showed up. "I want to be clear," Corin said. "Something is happening to this town, and it began the moment that man stepped into the Holloway place." Someone muttered, "He's not a man." No one laughed. That night, the desert around Ashridge shimmered strangely. Coyotes refused to howl. Crickets stopped chirping. A soft glow, like embers under flesh, pulsed beneath the dirt. Nora Mabel stood at her window and sobbing wept. Her flowers had begun to bloom again, but they opened into tiny gaping mouths. And under the swing at the park, a dark imprint began to form, knees in the dirt. Back at Holloway House, Ellis lit no candles. He sat in the dark, whispering names. Not to summon, to warn. But only one name answered. Corin. At the mayor's house, the power went out. Glass cracked in perfect circles across every window. And from beneath her bed, something hiss whispered her childhood nickname, the one no one alive should know. She didn't scream. She couldn't. Her mouth had disappeared.
They found Corin Harrow the next morning.
Alive. Sort of. She sat in her kitchen chair, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her eyes blinked, tracked movement, but her face showed no emotion, no recognition, no mouth. The skin where it should have been was smooth, pale, and pulsing slightly with each breath. The EMT said it was a trauma response. The townspeople knew better. Ellis didn't leave Holloway House. He stood at the attic window, staring out toward the main street. In his hand, he held Corin's high school yearbook, open to a page where 4 signatures had been circled. Under one, a note. "Keep quiet. No one needs to know what we did." He traced the ink with his finger. Then, whispered to the walls.
One more, then the others.
The shadows behind him twitched in approval. That evening, Corinne's memories began to return. She was still mute, still frozen. But inside her mind, something cracked open. She saw herself at 17, laughing in a field behind Holloway Hill, holding a camera. A boy, dark-haired, quiet, strange, stood in the distance, watching. He wasn't from town. No one knew his name. Later, the camera was found, smashed. The boy wasn't seen again. Corinne never told anyone what happened, but she remembered now. And something remembered with her. In Ellis's room, the box on the floor rattled once, then stopped. The mirror across the room shattered inward, and on the wall behind him, 4 shadows emerged. Long, distorted, pulsing like hearts. Each bore a name. One of them was Corinne.
That night, Ellis didn't sleep. He sat in a ring of salt, the wooden box at his feet. Inside it, the relics began to hum. Faint, faint, rhythmic, like breath through teeth. He opened the box slowly. The items had shifted. The child's drawing was now soaked with red. The locket's chain had twisted into a spiral, and the camera button, once silent, clicked. No one had touched it. Across town, silence shattered. Dogs began to howl. Wind swept through alleyways carrying whispers. You saw, you saw, you saw. People locked doors. But one woman, Sally Rourke, 58, retired nurse, stood in her hallway staring at a wall photo. It was her high school class. In the background, blurry and forgotten, was a boy with dark eyes. She didn't remember him, but he remembered her. The photo peeled itself from the wall and dropped at her feet. When she picked it up, her hand bled from the edges. The name, Farid, had been etched into the glass. At the church, candles lit themselves. The bell rang once. No rope pulled it. Smoke curled in the shape of letters above the altar. Witness. Back at Holloway House, Ellis whispered to the shadows. You were there. You remember their faces. You saw what they did. The air stiffened. From the darkest corner of the room, a voice answered, not human, not kind. You show me, and I will show them. Ellis nodded. He lifted the drawing and placed it into the fire, and as the flames took it, somewhere far across Ashridge, someone began to scream. By morning, Ashridge had changed. Windows were boarded, streets were empty. Even the air felt dense, thick with silence. At the general store, the clerk sat behind the counter, humming tunelessly, rocking back and forth. A fly crawled slowly across his eye. He didn't blink. At the diner, plates remained on tables, half-eaten meals untouched. No customers, no cook, just forks slowly spinning. Mère Corinne was gone. Only her clothes remained, folded neatly on her bed. No blood, no sign of a struggle. But on the wall above her headboard, written in smeared ash, were the words, "She remembers too late." Sally Rourke locked herself in her basement. She tried to burn the photograph. It wouldn't burn. She tried to tear it. The paper cut her deeply on the same scar she'd had since high school. She screamed, not from pain, from recognition, because the boy in the background now had a face, and it was smiling. At Holloway House, Ellis stood in front of the mirror again. This time, the reflection didn't match. The other Ellis was smiling, but the real one wasn't. Behind the reflected Ellis stood 4 shadowy figures, their faces shifting like smoke. They whispered in unison, "It begins from within." Ellis reached up, touched the mirror, and it felt like skin.
No one answered their phones in Ashridge anymore. Not because the lines were dead, because no one was calling. Those who remained stayed quiet. Not from fear, from something heavier, something that pressed down from within. At the schoolhouse, every chalkboard bore the same phrase, "We took." No one admitted to writing it, yet somehow the handwriting matched in every room. On the edge of town, a man named Harold Sykes stepped into the shallow creek bed behind his barn. He lay still in the mud, unmoving for hours. When his wife found him, his face looked surprised, different. His expression was empty, his mouth strangely motionless, as if sealed by something unseen. At the Holloway house, Ellis was preparing the room. He removed the floorboards, exposing the old foundation beneath. He painted a circle, not with anything violent, but with fine gray ash. And as he worked, he whispered names. But now each name seemed to answer back. The voices didn't sound like anyone he knew. Some were gasping, some sobbing. One even, laughed, soft and childlike. But all ended with the same word, yours. At sunset, Ashridge fell still. No dogs, no birds, not even the wind, just silence. And deep beneath the Holloway house, something began to stir, fully, for the first time in 34 years. It didn't roar, it didn't scream. It simply, smiled, and whispered one thing. "Show me what you became." That night, Ellis knelt inside the ash circle. The house groaned around him. The walls pulsed with heat. Outside, the wind spun in slow, perfect circles, never touching the house. He closed his eyes, and the room darkened further. Then came the voice, not from the floor or the walls or the ceiling, from his own mouth, but not in his tone. "You brought me," it said, "but you were always mine." Ellis didn't flinch. "You followed," he replied. "I waited. You remember their names. I kept them alive. You showed me pain. I gave it form." Then silence. And finally, "Do you want them to see you now?" Ellis opened his eyes. The walls were gone. He was standing in the center of Ashridge. Only it wasn't Ashridge. It was the memory of it. Holloway House stood but untouched. The school untouched. The church unburned. And across from him, standing in the same ash circle, was Ellis. Not him. A different version. Younger. Afraid. With blood on his hands. "You stayed inside," the younger version whispered. "You left me there." Ellis stepped forward. "I gave you voice." The younger Ellis looked up, and his mouth vanished. Back in the real world, the fire in the hearth flared violently. 4 shadows collapsed into one, and the name Fari burned
itself across the ceiling in black flame. Ashridge was unrecognizable. Shutters hung crooked. Air shimmered with heat from no sun. Time seemed a loop. Some swore they heard footsteps from yesterday echoing today. The town wanted to forget itself. But the names remained. Scorched into windows, scratched onto skin, screamed into empty homes. At the diner, all clocks struck 2:17. Again and again. Plates began to rattle. The jukebox, long broken, played one song. A child humming, over and over. Ellis stood in the center of the house, arms outstretched. The box was gone now, absorbed. The circle glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Around him, the air bent, resisting what was coming. But it was already here. He whispered to the room, "I brought the weight back." A voice answered, not Ferreth, but something older. "You brought the truth." Ellis exhaled. "I want them to see. Then you will stay." A pause. "You will stay until the last one forgets." Ellis didn't argue, didn't beg. He nodded, and the floor beneath him breathed once, then opened. Somewhere in the farthest corner of the town, a newborn cried, but its mouth did not move. Only its shadow did. Ashridge no longer had sound. No wind. No birds. Even the leaves didn't rustle. Only eyes moved. And shadows. Those who remained couldn't speak. Not because they had no mouths. Because the words had been taken. They tried writing. The ink bled into the paper, forming the same word. Remember. In the church, the altar was gone. In its place, a pool of still black water. Anyone who looked into it saw only themselves, but different. Each with something missing. An eye, a mouth, a name. Some refused to leave. Others never came out. At the edge of the town, Sally Rourke walked barefoot into the field behind Holloway Hill. She didn't look back. She lay down among the weeds and smiled, not from peace, but because, for the first time, she couldn't remember why she came. Beneath what was once the Holloway house, Fari remained, not lurking, not hiding, just waiting. Not for another name, not for another sacrifice, for silence to settle completely. Someone is still telling this story. Not Ellis, not anyone from Ashridge, but the words keep coming. You're reading them now. You don't know why. In the empty Holloway foundation, the ash circle remains unbroken. The floorboards are gone. The walls are gone. But the shape remains.
Visitors, those few who dare, report that standing inside the circle makes their ears ring. Some say they hear voices. Some say they hear nothing at all. But all of them leave with the same mark. A small gray scar where their shadow used to fall. Old files in the county archive have been erased. Google Maps shows a stretch of forest where Ashridge should be. No roads, no homes, just a note. Private land, do not enter. But sometimes, when zoomed in too far, you can see names burned into the soil. One of them is yours.
Still reading, still here.
Fari sees that. Fari is listening.
You made it to the end. But the end doesn't mean it's over. It means something else begins. Ashridge exists only in memory now. Not maps, not records, not even in dreams. Just memory. A memory you carry because you read it, because you saw it, because your name was written too. You'll feel it first when you speak. Certain words will sound different, like they were spoken already by someone else. Then in mirrors, something just behind your shoulder. Nothing there, not yet. The final gift of the mourner is not vengeance, not even justice. It is remembering, even when you want to forget, especially when you want to forget. The page doesn't end here, but you should stop reading now, because silence is the only thing that keeps him quiet, and you're running out of silence.